On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer. On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon.
Dr. Anthony Fauci takes the fifth over and over, and Republicans fume. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who led the hearing, joins us live with reaction and what comes next. Dr. Deborah Birx worked, her words, in the trenches with Dr. Fauci during COVID. Her thoughts on Fauci's diaries, his fondness for fame, and the seemingly ceaseless, snarling debate over COVID's origins. Michigan's having a bit of a moment. There's a white-hot Senate Democratic primary, recent presidential visit, and new prominence in the 2028 nominating calendar. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, well, she has some thoughts. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Let me welcome you to the Takeout. Is it a reckoning or retribution? Can it be both? COVID-19 created myriad miseries and harms: deaths, lockdowns, business closures, Zoom classrooms, curtailment of all manner of social activity, censorship, masking, distancing, and across our society, a deepening estrangement from appointed experts. Also, lives were saved. Families were thus kept whole. Vaccines were found rapidly and distributed efficiently through national collaboration. There were all manner of adaptations. Social safety nets were extended. Such is the tangled tale of COVID: successes and failures, preservation and destruction. Scriptwriters obsess over origin stories. There are times when politicians do as well. And that's what today ostensibly was about. The Senate committee, led by Kentucky Republican Rand Paul, he is standing by, you see him there, and we'll hear from him in a moment, questioned Dr. Anthony Fauci about COVID, specifically what he knew, what he suspected about its origins, and federal funding on his watch that might have played a role in its creation. That's the origin story, even though another character in that story, the Chinese Communist government that tolerated substandard safety at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, jailed early whistleblowers, and destroyed much of the traceable COVID evidence, was given far less attention. Senator Paul considers Fauci the central figure in what went wrong. Here was part of his opening statement.
You did not personally issue every lockdown order, close every school, or impose every mandate. But officials across the country invoked your authority to justify these decisions. And you presented your recommendations not as judgments open to debate, but as dictates of science itself. Your own words demonstrate that you understood the influence you exercised.
And here is what the senator said about federal research under Fauci's direction that augmented so-called gain-of-function research, which explores ways to alter viruses in potentially helpful, but also sometimes hazardous ways. There is a dispute about that kind of research and the novel coronavirus. We should also note Senator Paul and Dr. Fauci don't even agree on what constitutes gain-of-function research.
You could not hide that your agency had funded the Wuhan research or your long history of defending gain-of-function research. The only alternative left was to argue that COVID-19 did not originate in the Wuhan lab. You were not a detached observer. You had an institutional interest in the public believing that federally funded research had nothing to do with the pandemic.
Paul, over the weekend, released unredacted diaries Dr. Fauci kept during the pandemic and pointed to contradictions between his private thoughts and public statements about COVID's origins. Paul then mentioned President Biden's pardon for Dr. Fauci that covers any and all actions from 2014 until the last day of Biden's presidency.
A pardon may protect a person from criminal prosecution. It doesn't rewrite history. It does not erase documents. It does not convert a misleading statement into a truthful one. And it does not prevent Congress from establishing what happened.
Dr. Fauci, when he spoke to the committee, said he did not believe today was about what actually happened, but about something sinister. So sinister, he said, silence was his wisest option.
However, Given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars.
Thus, Dr. Fauci more than 100 times invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. When witnesses do this, they tend to do it universally, creating a sort of theater of the absurd draped in a core constitutional right.
Well, nothing says honesty like taking the Fifth, huh, Doc? Let's try something. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you wearing?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Republicans mocked Dr. Fauci's use of the Fifth Amendment, doubting whether it even applied to someone covered by a pardon. Democrats said this standoff was about something else.
Republicans are eager to rebrand you as a villain in order to distract from their own failure to protect Americans from soaring health care costs. They've been rising astronomically in the last couple of years. And from unsafe food, which has caused cyclospora to spread, and resurgent measles as a result of the anti-vaccine policy. This hearing is the culmination of a years-long crusade, which started more than 6 years ago when Dr. Fauci dared to contradict President Trump.
The Senate committee has oversight power. Senator Paul said this by way of explaining what happened today may not be the last word on Dr. Fauci.
The committee will have to consider, after this hearing, what appropriate action should be taken against you for the failure to testify after being directed to do so. It's against the law to obstruct an investigation of Congress. There will be repercussions to your refusal to testify today.
And Senator Paul, I'm happy to say, joins us now. Senator, it's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
What are the repercussions that Dr. Fauci may face?
You know, it's against the law to disrupt or obstruct a congressional investigation. There is a charge that can be voted upon called contempt of Congress. It's a resolution. If it passes, it will be sent to the Department of Justice with the recommendation of prosecuting. There is a legal question that attaches to this. Can the Fifth Amendment be taken, or can you ask for the Fifth Amendment protections when you've already been granted immunity through a pardon? I don't think this has ever been truly and fully adjudicated. There aren't that many people with pardons that have come before a congressional committee and refused to testify, so it's a limited number. But I think there are some precedents, but a court ultimately would have to determine, does the Fifth Amendment apply to someone who already has a pardon? The very last question I asked him was very specific to his pardon. Given the years that you were pardoned for, during that period of time, did you destroy records? And he refused to answer that. And I think he is protected completely. All it takes is an honest answer. Even if he has destroyed records, which we believe he did, his assistant had an email that we put forward that said, hey, Dr. Fauci, congratulations, I deleted tons of your emails over the weekend. So we do believe he destroyed records. That's against the law. And I think that he could have answered that honestly, and he wouldn't have had any problem, no criminality because of his pardon. But in choosing not to answer it, I think it is obstruction of Congress, and I think there is a very real chance that he could be prosecuted for that.
Is that what you expected him to do today, Senator Paul? And do you believe that, therefore, re-emphasizes the point you've long made, that there is something disingenuous about Dr. Fauci's engagement with the public on this particular subject?
Well, there absolutely is something disingenuous. He's said the opposite privately from publicly. Privately, he found out in January of 2020 that the infection did not start in the wet market from wild animals. The original infection came from people not connected to the wet market. But for 5 years, including on most of the network shows, he has said repeatedly over and over, it came from the wet market. So he said the opposite in public to things he said in private. The virologists that he got together at the end of January in 2020, they all told him it looks like the virus has been manipulated. It has a special cleavage site called a furin cleavage site that doesn't occur in that family of viruses. There is suspicious aspects to this sequence for the virus. And yet publicly, they all circled wagons and a few weeks later produced a paper saying this is not a laboratory construct. Very, very certain language, not conjecture, not possible. They said it was not. About a month later, a group of scientists then said it was all conspiracy theory. I wasn't even involved in the debate. The first year, I was concerned about the virus and what we should do health-wise, but I really wasn't concerned with the origins. But the interesting thing is they circled the wagons, but all along, they were still saying privately, oh my goodness, I think this might have come from the lab. Well, they're publicly saying no way. Why? Because they all were involved with funding it. Primarily, Anthony Fauci approved the funding, not only of this, but for a decade before. The most famous gain-of-function experiment is Ron Fauci out of the Netherlands. The NIAID, Fauci's group, funded it, and they took the bird flu, which has about 50% human mortality, but fortunately doesn't infect humans very well and doesn't go human to human. They said, what if we do 8 mutations and make it aerosolized and spread between humans? That is sort of like a Frankenstein experiment. And much of the scientific world came out and said, oh my goodness, the risks of this outweigh the benefits, except for one prominent person, Anthony Fauci, who said, oh no, the knowledge we gain definitely outweighs the benefits here, or outweighs the risk. And he was all in for gain of function, not just with COVID. He was all in with gain of function for a decade. So he does bear responsibility here for perhaps the worst medical decision in our history, and that is to fund dangerous research in a less than safe lab, in a totalitarian country, creating respiratory viruses that have increased pathogenicity and increased transmissibility.
And what do you say, Senator Paul, when I bring up the fact that the Chinese Communist Party did everything it could in the earliest stages of this to deny the ability for you or anyone else to independently understand what the origins were, or who even were patients 1, 2, and 3? Whistleblowers were jailed. Some died in prison. Already patients died in prison. They destroyed all of the wet market evidence. They shut down the lab. Isn't there any culpability that you're concerned about in that direction?
Absolutely. And the earliest sequences of this, we only found out about the sequence. The government of China was refusing to give this. A brave Chinese scientist put it online at 2 in the morning on like January 11th, 2020. So yes, I wrote a book about this and dedicated it to the young ophthalmologist. I'm an ophthalmologist. The young ophthalmologist who died was trying to warn people that the X-ray findings, the CT of the chest, looked suspiciously like SARS from 2003. Meanwhile, the Chinese government was saying, nothing to see here, doesn't go human to human. But in that same vein, Anthony Fauci also tried to say it came from nature, and that's very different than coming from a lab. If it comes from nature, it's typically sluggish. It doesn't go human to human well. That's what happened in 2003. And you know what? Quarantine and other normal things worked. The reason they didn't work for COVID is we believe that the virus was adapted in the lab to be very transmissible. You saw how infectious it was. You could look at somebody 30 feet away and get this thing. It was incredibly infectious, but that's because we believe it was adapted for humans. If you take COVID-19 in February of 2020 and you try to infect a bat, it won't infect bats. We can't find an intermediate animal that was plausible that it even infects. They did an experiment on a supercomputer in Australia. I think it was Oracle supercomputer. They said, which animal does it fit most better? If you do the lock and key of the virus, which cells does it infect most perfectly? Humans. that doesn't sound like an animal virus. That sounds like an animal virus that has been changed into a human virus. So everything points towards humans. So should there be some responsibility for Anthony Fauci, who is an advocate of gain-of-function research, will not tell the truth, and will not admit that it might have happened on his watch at his behest?
Just to pick up on what you just said, Senator Paul, because I think it's important. Might have happened. We will never know for certain, will we? The absolute origin?
It's all about sort of estimates. Even the scientists who said it came from nature were still privately, even after they wrote a paper saying it didn't come from the lab, were saying, I'm 30%, uncertain that it might have come from the lab. I'm 50% uncertain. But there's a lot of evidence that points towards it. 80,000 animals were tested in the market, and afterwards, none of them had COVID. They checked antibodies for people who handle the animals, the people that are the butchers in the market. In 2003, when they did this, and the Chinese did the testing, in 2003, they found that the animals had positive virus, a variety of the viruses. They also found that the handlers all had antibodies, a much higher rate than the general population. And then they quarantined, but the disease didn't go very fast. In 2002, 2003, only about 8,000 people got it. It had a 10% mortality. 800 people died, but quarantine worked. The reason quarantine didn't work here is this thing had been adapted so that it could be transmitted asymptomatically, which is even the opposite of most flus. One reason flus die out is because people are sick and they stay home. One, everybody gets the flu and they get immunity, but also people that are sick tend not to go out. With COVID, people tend not to be sick, and so it continues to spread. We think that happened in a lab, not naturally.
Before I let you go, Senator Paul, and I appreciate your time, you've talked in today's hearing, and many Republicans did, about the importance of transparency, accountability, and the public being capable of handling hard information. Today, on his X account, the governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, wrote the following. Today, Rand Paul wants to force an 85-year-old Dr. Anthony Fauci to address the American people, but refuses to ask the same of 84-year-old Mitch McConnell. In the spirit of transparency, does the Senate, does the American public need to know more about Senator McConnell's health, his well-being, and when, if ever, he'll be able to capably return to the Senate?
I think they're reasonable questions, and people are asking those questions. I think there's been a slowness to reveal his health status, but that's sort of his decision. It's not like he's calling me up and saying, hey, should I release my records? So I think there's been a slowness to release those records, but I think the ultimate decision has been made. He made this decision a year ago not to run for re-election because he is getting older and he has more health problems. So we have had a variety of people miss time, though, and there has been a certain amount of circumspectness. John Fetterman missed months and months, and I was one of those who said, lay off the guy, he's got health problems, let him recover. Senator Lujan was out with a significant stroke for a long time. Mark Kirk was out for nearly a year. Senator Johnson from South Dakota was out for a long time. So I don't know, we're human and we have health problems too. I think it is best to try to reveal, particularly when you miss your job, what's wrong with you and when you'll be back. But sometimes you don't know. For all I know, if there was an important vote, he might be here today. There are many votes that happen, but there hasn't been anything so far where he's been the deciding vote. And look, I'm one who's had many, many political differences with Mitch McConnell, but I think, we ought to treat each other with a little bit of respect, and I would do the same whether he was a Republican or a Democrat.
Senator Rand Paul, Kentucky Republican, I appreciate the time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joined now by Dr. Deborah Birx, who served as White House Coronavirus Response Coordinator during the Trump administration. Dr. Birx, I'm so glad you're here with us. You heard Senator Rand Paul. You probably watched some of the hearing today. I'd like your takeaways.
First and foremost, I have worked with Dr. Fauci for a long time, and I know him as an excellent physician and researcher. Let's set that aside and just say and I think the reason why he's in this position uniquely is because he went through the two administrations that really had to handle COVID. And there are people on the left that disagree how the right handle it, and there are people on the right that disagree how the left handle it. And I think Senator Fetterman, got it the most right for all of us. He said, as lieutenant governor, I'm constantly asking myself, did I get the balance right between saving lives and preserving people's livelihoods? And that is a very deep question. And I think what you heard today is still persistent anger over that question not being answered adequately for most Americans. And that's why, if we're in public health, we've got to get to that answer. And we have to have a better way forward than this.
And Dr. Birx, are we going to get to that answer by constantly relitigating whether or not this was animal-born or lab-born?
Well, the reason that is important is we do need additional guardrails, because what we've really worked on the issues of molecular insertions and molecular changes, but you can get to the same place, it takes longer, by serially passaging animal viruses in human cell lines. And that's not ever specifically covered in this gain-of-function research. And so we all know that there have been lab accidents. I have seen them myself. And we want to protect the laboratory workers, and we want to protect the community that surrounds that lab. And so there does need to be really additional policy around these issues. And I'm hoping that going forward, we really look at these and have good policies that protect the lab workers, that protect the American public, and really get us ready with trust with the American people. Because right now, if we had a problem, we'd split down Democratic and Republican lines. And I can tell you, there's no county that's one way or the other. And so everybody's at risk in those counties.
It was said today many times by Republicans, or implied rather, that Dr. Fauci was a villain or a monster or someone who had some reckoning to come to because of all the mistakes he made and he foisted on the American public. I'd like your evaluation of that line of criticism.
I think all of us need to be quite honest with ourselves about how not only the information evolved, but the needs for the relevant, what we call countermeasures, should have also evolved. What do I mean by that? When this first hit, we didn't have enough testing out there. We couldn't stop the spread in any way. Hospitals were being overrun. We didn't have a supply chain that matched the need. And so the first part and the few months were a crisis. But once we got additional therapies, monoclonal antibodies, long-acting monoclonal antibodies, remdesivir, where there were actually additional treatments, then you can pull back on some of the mitigation. But because it was an election year, there were states that persisted in their very tight mitigations, and others that showed us a way that you could open K through 12 and higher ed. And I saw it myself. If you gave higher ed tests, they really prevented spread. And so we should have a dialogue about how are we going to do this next time? How are we going to prevent spread? How do we keep K through 12 open? How do we keep higher ed open? How do we keep businesses open? And there's a way to do it. And then we have that roadmap, but we need to get that down in real concrete terms and have both the right and the left agree that that's the best way forward.
Before I let you go, Dr. Birx, you know Dr. Fauci well. In his diaries, it is clear there are times he is captivated by his rising international fame. Is that a recognizable trait of his?
Well, if you've been to his office, you can see that he has a lot of photos of his dealing with high-level influencers and presidents. That is something that means something to him. It doesn't mean something to me, so it's difficult for me to comment. But I don't think that clouded his judgment on what he was trying to do for the American people. We all are human, and I hope we step back and allow Dr. Fauci that humanness, at the same time holding Dr. Fauci, myself, and others accountable to really make this a better response next time.
Dr. Deborah Birx, I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
CBS News medical correspondent Celine Gounder joins me now. She's also an infectious disease specialist and served on Biden's Transition COVID Advisory Board. Dr. Gounder, always good to have you with us. Your reaction to what you saw play out today in that Senate hearing?
Yeah, a few different things. So one, the 80,000 animals that Senator Rand Paul just cited, actually, again, in his interview with you, that number is wrong in several different ways. So at the seafood wet market, the China CDC sampled over 450 specimens from 18 different species, but those species were not the species we think may actually have harbored SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. They tested strays, they tested pets, they tested frozen merchandise and fish tanks, all of which, not surprisingly, came back negative. The animals we think are possibly the carriers, the hosts, are raccoon dogs, masked palm civets, and bamboo rats. And in fact, there was DNA from those three mammals concentrated with SARS-CoV-2 positive samples. That 80,000 figure actually relates to testing out in the provinces. Those were mostly routine livestock surveillance, not specific to the Wuhan wet market. And then finally, the animals in that wet market were removed on January 1st of 2020 before sampling could even begin. So we never got samples of the real candidate hosts. And that, if anything, was the cover up here.
And there are two issues. Where did it come from? And what, if any, relevance did any funding for a type of research, and gain of function has molecular and serial passage, have to do with it? And we don't have the answer to either of those all these years later.
Sure. So the two leading hypotheses from the beginning were either a natural spillover event from wild animals into humans. That is actually how most historically infectious diseases have arisen, whether that is tuberculosis or measles or SARS or HIV, Ebola, the list goes on. That's in general how we've seen these things emerge. There have been the occasional lab accidents, not causing epidemics or pandemics, by the way, but that is one of the other hypotheses that has been entertained since the beginning. What are the things that argue for and against that? Well, for this lab incident hypothesis is the fact that the outbreak started in the city in China where China had its leading coronavirus lab. They were doing gain of function research, and sometimes at a lower biosafety level than we would typically use here in the United States. What is going for the natural spillover hypothesis? Well, first of all, that's historically how these things have happened. The earliest cluster of cases was linked to a single wet market in Wuhan. Now, that may not have been the initial introduction, which is one of the points Dr. Fauci was making in his diary, but rather the amplifier, where you have a lot of people together, a lot of animals together, where you can amplify, kind of think of it as a super spreader event. We also saw evidence of two separate introductions with slightly different variants of the virus weeks apart. And that would actually argue for a natural spillover, a lab accident, you see one event. And then the swabs, again, from the market that tested positive also carried DNA from mammals that are potential hosts for this.
Dr. Celine Gounder, thank you for helping us roll up our sleeves for a full half hour on this very important topic. I appreciate it very much. Still to come, on the Takeout, Michigan Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. The Senate primary between Haley Stevens and Abdul El-Sayed is a window into the party's divisions. That's obvious, but those divisions, well, can they be repaired? Also, the Federal Reserve left interest rates unchanged today, but there was some inclination expressed for higher rates, and that made the Dow go from bad to worse. We'll take a look. Plus, President Trump's newest profanity-laced tirade about, you guessed it, another potential bombing threat against Iran. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back to Takeout. A quick check of your calendar. Less than 1 week away from the very closely watched, some might say obsessively watched, Democratic Senate primary in Michigan between Haley Stevens and Abdul El-Sayed. Joining us now to discuss this and a lot more Michigan stuff, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Congresswoman, always great to have you on the show. I know you're not endorsing in the Senate Democratic primary. That's your right. But can the party, do you think, whatever the outcome, come back together and keep this seat in Democratic hands because it's being handed off by Gary Peters, who's not seeking re-election?
Good afternoon. It's always good to see you. I like it better when we're talking restaurants, but this is what I'm going to say to you, Garrett. We have no choice. We have to come together. And the energy that you are seeing in this primary is people that know that we have got to stand up to what we have seen happen in Washington since President Trump became president. So I'm not going to say that the day after the election isn't going to have intense emotional feelings, but we are all going to have to come together to keep this Senate seat Democratic.
You know Dearborn a lot better than I do, but I was there in 2024, and I talked to Democrats who said, yeah, I know the have to part, but I'm not gonna, because they were upset about the Middle East. They were upset about Israel, and they didn't show up in Michigan, and Trump won.
So I'm going to tell you, I've talked to many people from Dearborn. Some did end up coming out, leaving the uncommitted and supporting the vice president, but they know what's at stake. They are hurting. And I'm going to tell you what's the most important issue to people right now. What they know that we have to stand up to is fighting for a more affordable America. And if you're in Dearborn, if you're in the Upper Peninsula, if you're downriver that I represent, everybody is talking about the cost of groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of housing, and they're also talking about health care. And too many people have lost health care. They can't afford to go to the doctor. They can't afford their medicine. And the big bad bill, which also, for the record, got food assistance, is and SNAP. People are scared, hurt, and worried. And the larger issue is affordability. Michigan is a complex state. We have people that come from significant Jewish backgrounds. Yes, I lived in Dearborn. These are my friends, but in the end, they've got to come together to stand up to what we are seeing, a war in Iran right now, among other issues.
In 2016, you were kind enough to pull me aside and say Trump looked formidable to you in Michigan and other parts of the upper Midwest, and that you considered his skills better than being appreciated at the time by leading Democrats. Do you still believe that? And when you saw him in Michigan earlier this week, do you think he's as formidable as he used to be?
No, I'm going to tell you. I mean, I did. You know that. I said it to you months before he won Michigan, that I was in those labor halls. I heard him talking. He was appealing to working men and women. He understood their issues, and Democrats weren't talking about the issues that matter to them. I'll tell you, I've talked to a lot of people that supported President Trump, what'll be 2 years in November, who are hurting. They were talking about affordability 2 years ago, but they didn't think that they would see the cost of gasoline go up. Young people are worried that we're going to end up in a war, and are they potentially going to be drafted? Well, auto workers, I mean, our relationship with Canada has always been a prized relationship between our two countries. We've supported each other in the auto industry. Auto workers are worried about their jobs. And when he talked about trade in 2016, they thought he was going to fight for them. But even now, he's getting softer on China than people thought he might have been. So there's not to say that they're not still Trump supporters here, but this administration, this 4-year term, is far different than the 2016 term.
It's not definite, as you know, but the DNC is moving closer to a new 2028 primary calendar. Michigan more prominent than it has been. Give me your sense of Michigan's role in the next nominee for the Democratic Party.
Well, as you know, Garrett, I was part of that Rules Committee, and I don't think you look at one state, you look at the first 6 states that we voted on last week and will vote at the DNC meeting. They're reflective of the Democratic, of quite frankly, the country. And if you look at each state, it represents the different regions of the country. It represents all of the demographics. I do think it's important that there be we have 2 large states now that are going to be in this, Michigan and Virginia, larger states, but there's still states that you can campaign in. And I quite frankly feel very strongly that the issues that you just talked about, which are going to be issues in October, need to be part of the early primary system so that you hear how candidates are going to talk about them and deal with them. So it's not a crisis in October that costs us an election. We see people who understand how people on all sides are hurting and how you're going to talk about it.
Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, I appreciate it. Remember, you can always call me Major. Thanks so much for your time. Coming up, CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady on the Fed's decision to leave interest rates unchanged. You're watching The Takeout. Welcome back, and thank you for hanging out with us. The Federal Reserve announced its fifth interest rate decision of the year, and the board voted for no change. The central bank will hold its benchmark rate steady at a range of 3.5% to 3.75%. That's not as easy to read as you might think it is. Despite grappling with stubborn inflation and oil price volatility, that's what the data is doing in there. Markets opened down, and it only got worse after the Fed decision. The Dow, NASDAQ, and S&P 500 all dropped more than 1.5% today. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joins me now. Kelly, break it down.
Yeah, look, I mean, interest rates holding steady. This wasn't much of a surprise. The market was pricing in a 64% chance that was going to happen. But I think, frankly, Major, my bigger takeaway was the fact that this was not a unanimous decision. It was 9-3. There were 3 voting members of the Fed that actually wanted to hike rates by 0.25 percentage point. And the reason being is that inflation is sticky. We have been above the Fed's 2% target for over 5 years right now. And we're seeing oil prices surge again with things heating back up with Iran. That was why the markets opened significantly down this morning. And it kind of felt like, based on what Warsh was saying in that press conference, he kept calling it a good family fight, Major. I'm wondering when this is going to become that Thanksgiving family blow up. Because if you think about September, if we're continuing on the way that energy prices are moving right now, it's going to make more of a case for an interest rate hike. Certainly not something that the president wants to see, but something that Warsh said, and I quote, "We will not hesitate to act if things require it."
And Kelly, quick reminder to our audience how the Fed board works and what the vote needs to be to actually have an interest rate go up or go down.
Simple majority, right? There are 12 voting members, and you need to have a majority to make a change or to not make a change, right? So today you had 9 people saying, let's hold rates steady, 3 people saying, I want to hike, not close to a majority. But based on the discussion that he describes, it feels like the vibe is not whether we hike interest rates, but more becoming when, Major.
And the Fed chairman does not have a super vote. It's one vote just like every other Fed governor, correct?
That's right. So when everyone was saying, oh, Kevin Warsh, he's President Trump's pick, he's going to raise, or rather he's going to lower interest rates, it's one person, one vote. You could be persuasive, maybe, and your vote can mean more in that room. But at the end of the day, it's just one vote.
Kelly O'Grady, I always appreciate the time. Thank you so very much. Coming up, another threat from Trump to strike Iran. This one, laced with profanity. Maybe that means it's more serious. Who knows? We'll try to find out. You're watching The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Here's a look at what else we and now you are watching this evening. President Trump once again vowing to hit Iran hard. This following Central Command saying it thwarted an attempted surprise attack by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Trump told Fox News he's going to, quote, beat the effing S out of them. We don't do all the profanity from the president here. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia also, interestingly, conducted joint strikes targeting what was called Iran-aligned terrorists operating inside Iraq. Emergency workers in southern Japan still searching for survivors after the powerful 6.8 magnitude earthquake. Sweltering heat has created greater concern for those still trapped in the rubble. At least 18 people confirmed dead, more than 60 injured, including 6 reported as seriously injured. Aerial footage show the residential areas flattened, many of them. The White House released these renderings of a plan to renovate Washington Dulles International Airport in Northern Virginia. President and Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy announced this $22 billion plan today. CBS was the first to report that the president had brought in several design and engineering firms to submit 3-dimensional models he could review. Trump has called this airport, quote, terrible and incorrectly designed. A new poll shows President Trump's approval rating, well, it's hit a new low. Our political panel weighs in when we come back. This is The Takeout. Welcome back. You know I love it. Political panel time. Ophira Yeskel, Director of External Affairs, Democratic Governors Association. Jessica Anderson, Republican strategist, and importantly used to work at the Office of Management and Budget. I have mad respect for anyone who's an OMB vet because it's a super powerful agency in D.C. Great to have you here. I want to play for you sound from my interview with Senator Rand Paul about what may happen, not too distant future, dealing with Dr. Anthony Fauci and possible contempt of Congress. Listen.
We do believe he destroyed records. That's against the law. And I think that he could have answered that honestly, and he wouldn't have had any problem, no criminality because of his pardon. But in choosing not to answer it, I think it is obstruction of Congress, and I think there is a very real chance that he could be prosecuted for that.
Yeah, let me put these things together. Contempt of Congress. Oh, who should I call? The Trump Justice Department, which would probably not have any compunction about seeking a charge against Dr. Anthony Fauci based on the charges it sought against other people. Ophira?
Well, I think this is a pattern of weaponization that we've seen the Trump administration do.
Not accountability, weaponization.
Weaponization of the government against who they consider to be political enemies. And I think, frankly, this is why Trump's numbers are so underwater with the American people. We just saw a CNN poll that showed that 3/4 of the American people think he's focusing on the wrong things and focusing on going after Dr. Fauci instead of on how you're going to lower costs and deliver a vision for the American people. I think it's exactly why Republicans are looking so vulnerable heading into these midterms in less than 100 days.
Well, I think what's clear from today is that Congress is actually the one that is trying to hold Fauci accountable, not really from the directive of President Trump in this regard, but from Senator Rand Paul and using the Republican gavel to get some answers. I thought it was interesting today that Fauci claimed, pled the fifth over 100 times. He brought his lawyer in. There was a lot of fanfare the last 24 hours about his diary comments and really what was behind his thinking as Americans were dying. He was counting photographer clicks. So there's a lot here that I think Senator Paul is right to try to investigate, hold him accountable, but also to get some answers for the American people. But the last thing I'll say, and I think we're all aligned on this, no one wants to go back to 2020. So I would love for this moment with Fauci to be over very soon. And
because there are other things that polling data, to Ophira's point, voters do care about and would like a little bit of responsiveness to.
That's right. I think it's very natural for Congress to investigate and to hold accountable. That is their rule and prerogative, and it's certainly Senator Rand Paul's. But no, everyone I think has a little bit of just COVID fatigue, and we're just ready to move on. So answer the questions and let's move on.
So when you look at the polling universe right now, Jessica, I'll start with you. What do you see?
So it depends on any given day in the state.
No, I know, but
so
the
overall, Republicans continue to lag behind on a national environment. Republicans have always been kind of the sleeper when it comes to national polling. And then when you look at the state, you begin to see the state-by-state breakdowns where Republican candidates actually are doing well, and they're able to survive, if you will, in a tougher political national climate. I think you see that in Maine with Susan Collins' numbers being very aggressive right now. You certainly see it in Iowa. You see it with Mike Rogers' surge for that open seat in Michigan. Democratic primary next week, of course. I think that will bust right open. You see it in Ohio, right, with Senator John Husted mounting his first true incumbent Senate race against Sherrod Brown, who can't get enough of being beat by Republicans and came back a second time.
Vera, give me your thoughts.
Well, I mean, speaking of Ohio, the governor's race, there's in a dead heat. I think, speaking to the national environment being so tough for Republicans, because Vivek Ramaswamy says things like Medicare and Medicaid were a mistake. And in states like Michigan, you have John James, who's an election denier, who's focusing on how he can kowtow to Trump instead of how he'll lower costs for the American people. And I think
so. You're looking at those two governor's races because that's what you do, right?
Because that's what I do. I'm bringing it back to governors as I want to do. But I do think in the states we're seeing that in governor's races, this vision of having something to deliver that's a positive vision on the economy has been a real boon to Democratic candidates, putting a lot of races in our favor in some toss-up states like Iowa, like Ohio, like Georgia.
Give me your 30 seconds on the Wisconsin governor's race.
Well, obviously, it's a very lively primary on our side, and we're neutral in primaries. I think whoever comes out of that will be equipped to hold Tom Tiffany accountable. And again, speaking of Trump in the national environment, a member of Congress who has voted with him a lot of the time has voted for his agenda that's deeply unpopular with the American people and is hurting Wisconsin, whether it's tariffs and farm bankruptcies being on the rise or manufacturing. All these things, I think, are something that we're looking forward to holding Tom Tiffany accountable for in Wisconsin.
5 seconds. Who's going to win the Democratic Senate primary in Michigan?
They're both great.
Oh my gosh. Can I answer my
That's what happens. That's what happens. A very ethical Jessica Anderson. Thank you very much. Happy Wednesday, everyone. You know what this is. Quick reminder, The Takeout, relentlessly curious, reliably civil, and just occasionally clever. Never too much. The Day Report coming your way next.